Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the world of deception, the kind of deception that wears a smile so convincing it would make even the most skeptical among us drop our guard. You walk through a crowded room, catching glances of people with warm eyes and easy laughs. But somewhere in that crowd lurks a master manipulator, someone who's perfected the art of the smile that deceives. Their grin stretches from ear to ear, and yet there's a flicker of calculation hiding behind those eyes. You probably won't survive this without questioning every smile you've ever encountered. But hey, that's half the fun of tonight's journey. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a place where history and psychology collide, where the most dangerous predators wear the friendliest masks. Picture Cleopatra, with her legendary charm and smile that could conquer empires. Historians still argue whether her allure was born of genuine affection or calculated strategy. You'd think a smile is just a simple upturn of the lips, but that's where the trap lies. It's anything but simple. Imagine walking into a medieval banquet. The hall is filled with laughter, and the air is thick with the smell of spiced wine and roasted meat. A nobleman leans in with a grin so wide you can't help but trust him, but behind that grin hides a plan to secure your lands, your wealth, or your loyalty. That's the power of the smile. It disarms you before the dagger even leaves its sheath. Modern psychology calls this nonverbal manipulation, and it's been around as long as humans have been telling lies. A charming grin triggers your brain to release oxytocin, the trust hormone, fooling you into lowering your guard. Even in the cold glow of a smartphone screen, that same smile emoji can get you to click, to buy, to believe. Historians still argue whether some of history's most famous figures, like Rasputin with his hypnotic eyes or Elizabeth Bathory with her gracious courtesies, were born manipulators or simply learned from their environments. Either way, their smiles could melt away suspicion faster than a warm breeze. As you trudge deeper into this world of charming predators, you realize that the smile is more than a social courtesy, it's a weapon. Think of Ted Bundy, charming, funny, the guy you'd want to grab a beer with. And yet, behind that dazzling smile lay a darkness few could imagine. You probably wouldn't survive a minute in his presence if you didn't learn to see past the grin. Even in ancient Rome, emperors like Nero and Caligula wielded smiles like daggers. Picture a banquet table draped in purple velvet, the emperor leaning in with a reassuring smile just before ordering the deaths of rivals. Their smiles opened doors and closed them just as quickly. You wonder why we're wired to trust a smile. Blame evolution. In our tribal days, a smile signaled friendliness and safety, a sign that we wouldn't be eaten or exiled. But in the modern jungle, whether it's a corporate boardroom or a dating app, a smile can hide teeth sharper than any saber-toothed cat. Let's get personal for a moment. Remember that time you trusted someone who smiled at you? Maybe a coworker who offered to help, a date who swore they'd call, a friend who promised to keep your secret? And then, that smile turned cold. That's the moment the mask slipped, and you realized the smile was never about you. It was about them, and what they wanted. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. One famous study found that people with strong smiling skills, real or fake, were more likely to get promotions, win negotiations, and close sales. Manipulators know that too. The next time someone flashes a toothy grin, take a beat. Look for the tell, the eyes that don't quite crinkle, the tension in the jaw, the flicker of calculation in the brow. And here's a fringe tidbit. In the 1800s, charlatans in Europe practiced something called smile training, using mechanical devices to pull the lips upward and create the perfect, symmetrical grin. Even then, people knew the value of a smile in manipulating emotions and trust. Historians still argue whether this mechanical grin was more effective than natural charm, but one thing's for sure. The smile has always been a weapon of choice for the manipulator. As you walk through this dark corridor of smiles and shadows, remember this. The most dangerous predators rarely snarl or growl. They smile. You slip deeper into the fog of manipulation now, and every friendly glance seems suspect. The art of gaslighting waits around the corner, a psychological trick so potent it can make you doubt your own senses. You feel it in the way someone insists the sky is green when you're certain it's blue, or the way your memory suddenly seems like a trickster playing games with you. Imagine you're in a grand Victorian parlor, velvet curtains drawn, the flickering glow of gas lamps casting soft shadows on the walls. A man in a crisp waistcoat leans over a teacup, voice smooth as silk, telling you that your mind is slipping. You're imagining things, he purrs. Surely you know better than to question me. Historians still argue whether early hypnotists, like Mesmer and his animal magnetism, were healers or charlatans exploiting people's deepest insecurities. Gaslighting is more than just lying. It's an elaborate dance of confusion and doubt. Picture a lover who forgets your birthday, then convinces you that you never mentioned it in the first place. A boss who overlooks your achievements, then insists you're not working hard enough. With every repeated denial, your grip on reality weakens until you're adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The term itself comes from a 1938 play, Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife by dimming the lights and denying it until she doubts her own sanity. And it's not just confined to the theater. The method has been perfected in everything from toxic relationships to state propaganda. Modern politicians, tech gurus, and social media influencers can spin reality with alarming ease, blurring the line between fact and fiction until you can't remember what's real. Historians still argue whether ancient philosophers like Socrates, who asked endless questions and challenged assumptions, were the first gaslighters, or whether they simply sought the truth in a world full of half-truths. But one thing's certain, gaslighting is a slow poison, one that seeps into your mind and corrodes your confidence. Let's slow it down for a moment and talk about the power of repetition. Imagine a friend who constantly repeats, "You're so forgetful," or "You're always overreacting." At first, you might brush it off, but after the 10th time, you find yourself thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the problem. That's how gaslighting works, drip by drip, until the doubt seeps into your bones. In one of the darker corners of history, consider the infamous witch trials. Women, usually those on the margins of society, were accused of unimaginable crimes. When they protested their innocence, their denials were taken as proof of guilt. That's gaslighting in its most sinister form, making the victim's defense itself seem like a lie. And here's a quirky tidbit. In the 1950s, some psychologists believed that UFO sightings were a form of mass gaslighting, government efforts to sow confusion and paranoia. Historians still argue whether this was an actual psychological operation or just Cold War hysteria, but the effect is the same. Make people question what's real until they're easier to control. You can almost hear the manipulator's voice whispering in your ear. Are you sure you saw what you think you saw? Their tone is soft, their words honeyed, their smile warm. But underneath it all is the constant suggestion that your own mind is the enemy. As you trudge onward, the air thickens with doubt. Every step feels unsteady, every memory suspect. The beauty of gaslighting, if you can call it that, is that it requires no brute force, no physical restraint. Just words, perfectly timed, delivered with that same disarming smile you learned to fear in the last section. And so you walk this corridor of shifting shadows, your sense of self flickering like a candle in the wind, trying desperately to hold on to the fragile thread of reality. Because in this game of manipulation, nothing is more dangerous than losing sight of what's true. You move deeper into this maze of manipulation, where words cut sharper than any blade. The air feels cold here, a chill that settles in your bones as the next tool emerges, the silent treatment and the power of withholding. You can almost feel the hush that follows a slammed door or the pause after a single, disappointed sigh. You've probably felt it before, the sudden withdrawal of warmth, the hush that grows louder than any scream. Imagine standing in a medieval castle, a servant carrying a scroll of accusations against a nobleman. The nobleman says nothing, his eyes cold and distant. His silence is a blade, slicing through any defense you might muster. Historians still argue whether such cold aloofness was a sign of guilt or just the ultimate power play, silence as a sign of unbreakable resolve. In modern times, the silent treatment can feel like being exiled from your own life. a partner who stops replying to your messages, a friend who leaves your calls unanswered. It's the manipulator's way of saying, I control the air you breathe. This tactic leaves you starving for any crumb of acknowledgement, even if it's just a single word. And when that word comes, you cling to it like a lifeline. Psychologists describe this as a form of emotional punishment. The manipulator uses silence to control you by making you doubt yourself. Did you say something wrong? Did you do something to deserve this? The silence itself becomes the interrogator, forcing you to replay every word and action until you're begging for forgiveness for sins you're not even sure you committed. Historians still argue whether this tactic has its roots in ancient religious penance rituals. In the Middle Ages, silence was often prescribed as a form of self-punishment, a way to reflect on one's sins. But here's the twist. The manipulator flips that script, using silence not for self-reflection, but as a weapon to dominate you. Picture yourself in a 1950s household, where the family patriarch sits at the dinner table, refusing to speak. His wife and children glance at each other nervously, each trying to guess what they did wrong. The silence grows heavier than the air itself. The power dynamic shifts. His silence becomes a fortress no one dares breach. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some cultures, monks took vows of silence to seek enlightenment, but cunning leaders sometimes used this vow as a means to control novices, keeping them isolated and compliant. Even today, some cults and secret societies enforce silence as a way to strip away identity and mold new recruits. You walk further, every step echoing with questions you're too afraid to ask. Maybe you recall the friend who ghosted you, a modern twist on the silent treatment that leaves your mind racing with unanswered questions. Did they find someone better? Did you say something wrong? The manipulator thrives on that uncertainty, using it to draw you closer. And when they finally break the silence, it's like a cool drink after days in the desert. That single word, that faint smile, it feels like salvation. You'd do anything to keep it from slipping away again. That's the genius of this technique. It doesn't just punish you, it makes you grateful for the smallest sign of forgiveness. Historians still argue whether this emotional roller coaster is a learned behavior from early childhood, where the silent parent wields the ultimate power. Maybe it's something deeper, a primal fear of being abandoned by the tribe. Either way, the manipulator knows exactly how to twist that fear into a leash. As you reach the end of this silent corridor, you might find yourself listening for a voice that never comes. The manipulator stands in the shadows, arms folded, eyes half-lidded, waiting for you to break the silence first. Because the moment you do, the game is theirs to win. The air thickens as you move into the next layer of manipulation, where empathy becomes a trap rather than a lifeline. Here lies the art of fake vulnerability, a tactic that reels you in with trembling hands and tearful eyes, only to tighten the snare around your heart. You see it in the soft quiver of a lip, the way the voice breaks at just the right moment, and you feel compelled to rescue the one who claims to need you most. Imagine a Victorian street, lamplight pooling on rain-slicked cobblestones. A beggar in tattered clothes extends a trembling hand, eyes glistening with tears. But beneath the rags, perhaps there's a con artist who's learned that tears are worth more than threats. Historians still argue whether these street performers were desperate souls or cunning tricksters exploiting human kindness. Fake vulnerability is a masterclass in emotional puppetry. The manipulator weaves a tale of woe, maybe about a childhood of neglect or a broken heart, and every detail is designed to bypass your rational mind and tap straight into your compassion. They know that the quickest way to your loyalty is through your sympathy, and they wield it with surgical precision. Modern psychologists call this trauma bonding, where the victim bonds with the manipulator through shared pain, real or fabricated. Picture that friend who always seems to have a fresh crisis. Every time you try to pull away, they drown you in stories of how they'd be lost without you. You feel trapped between guilt and compassion. Historians still argue whether even the most infamous tyrants, think of Caligula, with his childhood tales of betrayal, or Ivan the Terrible, weeping over his murdered wife, used tears as tactics to hold their empires together. Maybe they believed their own stories, maybe they didn't. The line between true vulnerability and manipulation blurs, and that's the point. A quirky tidbit for you. In the 1800s, traveling medicine shows hired actors to pretend to be sick or injured, only to be miraculously cured by the product they sold. Audiences wept with joy at the cure and rushed to buy bottles of the elixir. The trick worked because people trusted tears more than words. You walk deeper into this web, and suddenly the manipulator's tears turn to anger when you don't react the way they want. That's the hook. Your sympathy is just the first step. Once you're caught, they tighten the grip by demanding your loyalty. Maybe they say, "No one else understands me like you do." Or, if you really cared, you'd stay. Remember that time a friend or partner bared their soul to you, telling you about their deepest scars, and then used that story to keep you from leaving? You felt honored at first, but later realized the story never changed, never healed, always a fresh wound for you to bandage. Historians still argue whether the manipulative use of vulnerability is a trait passed down through generations, learned in the home or in the cradle. Some psychologists say it's instinctual. Even a child knows that tears bring comfort, protection, and control. As you step over the threshold into this next room, you see it all so clearly. The trembling voice, the moist eyes, the quivering hands, each a calculated move in the manipulator's chess game. Every sigh, every sob, every carefully timed tremble is a pawn to keep you where they want you. And you, dear listener, stand at the edge of the board, ready to be moved. Because no matter how strong you think you are, no one is immune to the pull of a well-timed tear. The trick is knowing when it's real and when it's the bait. You move through a room cluttered with masks, each one worn for a different performance, and you realize this is where the manipulator's charm truly comes alive. Welcome to the world of love bombing, that dizzying high of affection that hits like a freight train before the real darkness emerges. Here, love feels like a tidal wave, impossible to resist, all-consuming, until it recedes and leaves you stranded on a barren shore. Picture a lavish ballroom in 18th century France, candlelight flickering across powdered wigs and painted faces. A courtier presses your hand to their lips, eyes shining with adoration. Every word is praise, every glance a promise. Historians still argue whether these extravagant displays of devotion were genuine passion or simply political maneuvering, designed to win favor and influence. Love bombing is the manipulator's way of hooking you fast. They shower you with praise, gifts, and constant attention. Every text message feels like a love song, every dinner date a royal feast. You've barely caught your breath before you're swept into a whirlpool of romantic declarations. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," they whisper, and you believe it. Modern psychologists point out that this tactic is especially dangerous because it feels so good. You're on a dopamine high, intoxicated by the constant affection. You ignore the little red flags because you're too busy enjoying the rush. It's like being handed a glass of champagne after a week in the desert. You drink it down without question. Historians still argue whether the ancient practice of courtly love, where knights wrote flowery poems to their ladies, was a genuine devotion or a power play. Some scholars think it was a way to control noblewomen by making them dependent on constant male adoration. Either way, the technique worked. The ladies swooned, and the knights became heroes in their own stories. A quirky tidbit: in the 1960s, certain cults would greet new members with overwhelming affection, only to isolate them later and demand absolute loyalty. The love-bombing phase was just the bait to lure people in before the real manipulation began. You think back to that friend who called you their soulmate after a single coffee date, who texted 50 times a day, who planned your entire future by the second week. At first, it felt like destiny. But slowly, you started to realize that every compliment was a thread in a net designed to hold you tight. That's the genius of love bombing. It's the honeymoon phase with a hidden price tag. Every sweet word is an investment in your loyalty, a down payment on your emotional obedience. Once you're hooked, the manipulator doesn't have to work so hard. You'll do anything to keep that high going. Historians still argue whether this pattern, grand affection followed by subtle control, originated in the royal courts of Europe, where monarchs showered courtiers with praise only to demand absolute fealty. Or maybe it's older still, buried deep in our tribal instincts. The leader who gives you a feast today expects you to fight for them tomorrow. As you trudge deeper into this chamber of charm, you realize that love bombing isn't just about romance. It can be friendship, 2. The friend who showers you with compliments, who loves everything you do until you dare to say no. That's when the warmth vanishes and the manipulator's true face emerges. And now, standing here, you feel the lingering glow of every love bomb that ever landed in your lap. Maybe you remember the compliments, the roses, the long, starry phone calls that left you breathless. But look closer, and you'll see the price tag on every single one. A bill that comes due the moment you try to break free. Your steps grow hesitant as you wander into the next chamber, where the manipulator's most cunning trick takes root: blame shifting. Here, every problem, every stumble, every emotional bruise becomes your fault, never theirs. It's a hall of mirrors, where every reflection shows you as the cause of every disaster. Imagine a grand courtroom in ancient Rome, the crowd silent as the accused stands before the emperor. A single finger points in your direction, and suddenly you're the villain in everyone's story. Historians still argue whether Roman leaders perfected this blame game as a political weapon or whether it was a byproduct of chaotic power struggles. Either way, the manipulator's power grew with each accusation. Modern manipulators know that blame is the ultimate deflection. You point out something they did wrong, maybe they forgot your birthday, or lied about where they were, and suddenly you're the selfish one. How dare you bring that up now? They snap. Or, if you just trusted me, none of this would have happened. The tables turn so fast your head spins. Psychologists call this tactic gaslighting, a term drawn from a 1940s film where a husband convinces his wife she's losing her mind. But historians still argue whether this behavior is a modern phenomenon or an ancient survival tactic. After all, in medieval Europe, powerful nobles often deflected blame onto their enemies to protect their own necks. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval courts, people would even hire scapegoats, servants paid to take the blame for their master's mistakes. Imagine that, a profession dedicated to absorbing blame, leaving the real manipulator unscathed. You think back to the friend who forgot your birthday, who promised to help but vanished when you needed them most. You confronted them, only to be met with tears and accusations. "I can't believe you'd be so insensitive," they said, twisting your words until you felt like the villain. Suddenly, you found yourself apologizing for being upset. That's the genius of blame shifting. It doesn't just deflect responsibility, it makes you question your own reality. Did I overreact? Maybe I'm too sensitive. The manipulator counts on this self-doubt to keep you off balance. It's like quicksand. The more you struggle to assert yourself, the deeper you sink into their narrative. Historians still argue whether this psychological quicksand developed as a defense mechanism in ancient times, where survival depended on group acceptance. If the tribe turned on you, you were as good as dead. So maybe we're hardwired to accept blame just to keep the peace. You remember that time you dared to call out a manipulator's lie, and suddenly the entire argument shifted to your tone or your lack of understanding. Instead of focusing on the issue at hand, you found yourself defending your character, your feelings, even your memories. That's the brilliance of blame shifting. It's a smokescreen that hides the real fire. Picture a medieval courtroom where the accused stands on a wooden platform, eyes downcast, while the cunning noble points and cries, "It's their fault." The crowd gasps. No one wants to be the next target, so they nod, eager to agree. You feel that same chill every time you're blamed for things that aren't your fault. Historians still argue whether this tactic was passed down through generations of political intrigue, or whether it simply evolved because it works so well. The manipulator doesn't care where it came from. They only care that it keeps you dancing to their tune. And as you leave this chamber of shifting blame, you might catch a glimpse of your own reflection, bent under the weight of guilt you never earned. That's how they win, by making you carry their sins, leaving them free to move on to the next victim. The corridors narrow as you step deeper, the air thick with the scent of old secrets and hidden lies. You arrive at the chamber of isolation, the manipulator's fortress of solitude where their control over you grows unchecked. Here, every connection you have is a threat to their power, and every bond you share is a chain they long to break. Imagine a medieval castle, cold stone walls closing in, the portcullis drawn tight. The lord of the castle, suspicious of any alliance that might undermine his rule, sends spies to watch your every move. Historians still argue whether these acts of paranoia were a necessary survival tactic or the mark of a tyrant driven mad by fear. Modern manipulators know that isolation is the most effective tool to break your spirit. Slowly, they begin to erode your confidence in others. They're jealous of us, they whisper. Or, they don't understand how special our bond is. Soon, every friend is an enemy, every family member a rival. A quirky tidbit from the annals of history. In 16th century England, some nobles kept their wives or husbands secluded in remote castles, fearing betrayal or plots. Their isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, too. Letters were intercepted, visitors carefully selected, and news from the outside world filtered like poison through a single cup. You think back to that time when a friend told you, "I don't think they're good for you," and your manipulator leapt on it. "See," they hissed. "They just don't want us to be happy." It felt like a conspiracy, a web of lies designed to separate you from your lifeline to the real world. Historians still argue whether this tactic originated in ancient tribal societies, where leaders feared alliances that might challenge their authority. Or perhaps it's older still, rooted in the primal fear of betrayal that stalks every relationship. Either way, the manipulator knows that once you're isolated, their power over you becomes absolute. Psychologists warn that isolation doesn't always mean literal loneliness. It can be emotional, too, a sense that no one else would understand or believe your story. That's the manipulator's goal, to make you doubt your own worthiness of connection. If they can convince you that everyone else is the enemy, then you'll run back to them every time. Picture a grand hall lined with portraits of every friend and family member you once trusted, their eyes now cold, turned away. That's how the manipulator wants you to see them, traitors in the gallery of your life. The more you believe their lies, the smaller your world becomes. Historians still argue whether this tactic was refined in the courts of Renaissance Italy, where ambitious nobles played one faction against another to keep rivals weak. Or maybe it's as simple as human nature. Divide and conquer works because no one likes to fight alone. You remember that time you tried to reach out to a friend, only to hear the manipulator's voice in your head, "They're just going to twist your words." They never really cared. And maybe you pulled back, just a little, until one day you realized you hadn't called in weeks, and when you did, the words felt foreign in your mouth. That's the ultimate triumph of isolation. You forget how to ask for help. You forget who you were before they started rewriting your story. You forget that there's a world beyond the one they've built for you, and it grows smaller every time you turn away from the people who might help you escape. And as you stand in this chamber of isolation, you might feel the walls pressing closer, the air getting thinner, the silence heavy as a stone. The manipulator is always there, whispering, "I'm the only one you need." And if you believe them, the rest of the world fades to a shadow. You step into a chamber illuminated by flickering candlelight, a room that feels both welcoming and strangely cold. This is the realm of triangulation, where the manipulator's web stretches wider than you ever thought possible. Here, you discover how they pull in others to tighten their grip on you, weaving a tapestry of confusion and competition that keeps you off balance and desperate for their approval. Imagine the intrigue-laced courts of 17th century France, where courtiers jostled for power by spreading rumors and playing allies against each other. Historians still argue whether these tactics were born out of ambition or necessity in a world where a single misstep could lead to the gallows. Modern manipulators might not wield swords, but they're just as cunning. They bring a third person into the dynamic, a friend, a coworker, even an ex, just to watch you squirm. You know, they're so much more understanding than you, they might say. Or, "I wish you were more like them." Suddenly, you're on edge, desperate to prove yourself, while the manipulator sits back and enjoys the show. A quirky tidbit. Some 18th century European nobles would host elaborate dinners where rivals were seated next to each other, forced to make polite conversation while their host smiled benignly. Every compliment, every whispered aside was carefully placed to stir up jealousy and resentment. You think back to that friend who always made you feel second best, who compared you to their amazing coworker or their incredible ex. You'd laugh it off, but the comparison stuck like a thorn in your side, making you question your worth. That's triangulation at its finest. It keeps you hooked, constantly vying for the manipulator's praise. Historians still argue whether this strategy evolved from ancient tribal dynamics, where leaders pitted followers against each other to prevent uprisings. Divide and conquer was an effective way to stay in power, after all. Psychologists warn that triangulation doesn't just create competition, it fosters dependence. When you feel insecure, you turn to the manipulator for reassurance. You're too busy proving yourself to notice the walls closing in. Every time they mention that other person, you try harder to please them, until you're stuck in a loop of jealousy and desperation. Picture a medieval tournament, the crowd roaring as knights clash in a spectacle of steel and sweat. Behind the scenes, a cunning noble leans back, watching as his rivals exhaust themselves fighting each other instead of challenging his rule. That's triangulation, a game where you're always the underdog, never the victor. Historians still argue whether this method was consciously taught, passed down through the generations like a secret weapon, or simply the byproduct of human insecurity. After all, who hasn't felt that sting of jealousy when someone else gets the praise you crave? You remember that time they praised your friend's cooking, their coworker's wit, their ex's sense of humor. Every compliment was a dagger, every comparison a reminder that you weren't enough. And every time you tried to call it out, they'd laugh. You're so sensitive. Can't you take a joke? That's the brilliance of triangulation. It leaves you questioning your own reactions. Are you really insecure? Or is the manipulator pulling the strings? In this room of mirrors and whispers, it's hard to tell. As you stand here, the candlelight flickers, casting shadows that dance like mocking faces on the walls. The manipulator's voice echoes in your mind. If only you were more like them. And suddenly, you're right back in the game, desperate for a prize that was never meant to be yours. The hallway stretches on, and with every step, the air feels thicker, like the atmosphere is pressing against your chest. You sense that you've arrived at the heart of the manipulator's domain, the chamber of love bombing. Here, you're greeted by a dazzling display of affection, flowers, sweet words, gifts so bright they almost blind you. But there's a catch, and it's hidden in the shadows behind that smile. Imagine the grand feast of ancient Persia, where kings and queens showered their subjects with lavish banquets and golden trinkets to secure their loyalty. Historians still argue whether these acts of generosity stemmed from genuine benevolence or calculated strategy. After all, a well-fed subject was less likely to revolt. Modern manipulators understand that love bombing is a double-edged sword. At first, it feels like heaven, attention, compliments, surprise gifts that make you feel like the most special person in the world. No one has ever made me feel like this, you think. But soon, that sweet affection turns sticky, like honey trapping a fly. A quirky tidbit. In 18th century Europe, suitors would sometimes compose entire books of poetry dedicated to their beloved, each verse dripping with devotion. Some scholars suspect that behind these literary love bombs lurked political motives, with the poetry meant to secure alliances, marriages, and inheritances rather than mere romance. You think back to that first week when they couldn't stop texting you, couldn't stop talking about your future together, couldn't stop telling you that you were their everything. Every word felt like magic. Every touch made you glow. But soon, the light dimmed, and the love bombing morphed into a tool for control. Historians still argue whether this pattern, a flood of affection followed by withdrawal, was refined in the harem politics of the Ottoman Empire, where sultans favored one consort lavishly before casting her aside for another. Jealousy and competition kept the women too busy fighting each other to challenge the sultan's power. Psychologists caution that love bombing is about creating dependence. The manipulator floods you with affection so you'll crave it, and when they withdraw it, you'll do anything to get it back. Every time they withhold their warmth, you question what you did wrong, desperate to recapture that initial rush. Picture an opulent ballroom in Versailles, where courtiers compete for the favor of the Sun King, their fates rising and falling with every smile or frown. The manipulator plays the same game, holding court over your emotions, deciding who gets the crown and who gets the cold shoulder. Historians still argue whether these games of favor were formalized in court etiquette or whether they simply evolved from human nature's thirst for validation. Either way, the manipulator uses them to keep you spinning in their orbit, always just a step behind their ever-changing moods. You remember that time they stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped caring, at least that's how it felt. Suddenly, the warmth was gone, and you were left in the cold, wondering what you did wrong. You apologized, you reached out, you tried harder, anything to bring back that flood of affection. That's the brilliance of love bombing. It makes you believe that their approval is the sun, and without it, you'll wither. But you don't notice the strings attached until it's too late, until you're dancing to their tune, desperate for their smile. As you stand in this chamber, surrounded by tokens of affection that now feel like chains, you realize that love bombing is just another way to keep you close, to keep you hoping. And every time they say, "I miss how things used to be," you find yourself reaching for a love that was never truly yours. You move on, the atmosphere thickening as you enter the chamber of projection, a dark, shadowy room where the manipulator's own faults and fears are tossed onto you like a cloak you never asked to wear. Here, blame isn't enough. The manipulator must make you carry their insecurities and shortcomings, disguising their flaws as your own. Imagine a courtroom in Renaissance Italy, where a cunning politician accused rivals not only of crimes they hadn't committed, but also of their own misdeeds, leaving their enemies tangled in webs of confusion. Historians still argue whether projection was a deliberate political weapon or just human nature's way of avoiding guilt. Modern manipulators wield projection like a shield and a sword. They accuse you of being controlling, selfish, or dishonest, when really, those are their behaviors playing out behind the scenes. You begin to question your actions, wondering if maybe you are the problem after all. "I'm not the one lying," you whisper to yourself, but doubt creeps in. A quirky tidbit. Some psychologists trace the concept of projection back to Freud, who described it as a defense mechanism where unwanted feelings are attributed to others. However, historians still argue whether such psychological insights fully explain how projection operates in toxic relationships. You recall moments when you voiced a concern, only to be met with, "You're so paranoid," or "Why are you always so needy?" It stings because part of you wonders if maybe, just maybe, they're right. This self-doubt is the manipulator's secret weapon, turning your own mind against you. Historians still debate whether projection was common in ancient royal courts, where rulers would accuse advisors or family members of treason simply to deflect suspicion from themselves. Power and paranoia often went hand in hand. Psychologists warn that projection can spiral into a destructive cycle. The more you try to defend yourself, the more accusations you attract. It's like a funhouse mirror reflecting your fears back at you in distorted shapes. Picture a royal throne room where the king points an accusing finger at his closest counselor, shouting of betrayal that only exists in his mind. The counselor's protests fall on deaf ears, while the court whispers and watches. That's projection in full force, turning reality upside down to maintain control. You remember the nights lying awake, replaying arguments, wondering if you really were too demanding or too jealous. The manipulator's voice echoes, "Look in the mirror. You're the one causing the trouble." It's a dizzying place to be, where your reality slips like water through your fingers. And as you stand here, tangled in their accusations, you realize projection isn't just about blame, it's about rewriting your identity. The manipulator doesn't just want control of your actions, they want control of your very self. You slip quietly through the dim corridors until you reach a room heavy with unspoken tension, the chamber of gaslighting. The walls seem to ripple with whispered denials and twisted truths. Here, reality bends and warps, and you find yourself doubting even your own senses, questioning what you know, what you remember, and, most dangerously, who you are. Think of the infamous witch trials of the 17th century, where accusations were based on hearsay and paranoia, and innocent people doubted their own sanity under relentless pressure. Historians still argue whether these trials were fueled more by genuine fear or by a collective need to control societal chaos. Gaslighting is the manipulator's psychological sleight of hand. That never happened, they say when you bring up a hurtful comment. You're imagining things. Slowly, Your memories become unreliable, your feelings invalid. You find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, wondering if you're losing your mind. A quirky tidbit. The term gaslighting originates from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into questioning her sanity by dimming the gaslights and denying the changes. It's a Hollywood drama turned real-life nightmare. You recall times when you said, "I felt hurt when you said that," only to be met with, "You're too sensitive. You're overreacting." It's as if your emotions are inconvenient obstacles the manipulator must erase to maintain their narrative. Historians still debate whether the roots of gaslighting can be traced to political propaganda techniques used in totalitarian regimes, where controlling perception was key to power, or if it's simply a human survival instinct turned dark. Psychologists warn that gaslighting is one of the most insidious forms of manipulation because it chips away at your self-trust. Without confidence in your own mind, you become utterly dependent on the manipulator for a sense of reality. Picture a foggy morning where the landscape shifts and changes, leaving you uncertain which way is up. That's gaslighting, a constant haze that clouds your judgment and leaves you disoriented. You remember the nights lying awake, doubting your memories, second-guessing your feelings. The manipulator's voice rings in your head. You're confused. You don't know what's real anymore. It's a cruel echo that burrows deeper with every repetition. As you stand in this warped chamber, you realize that gaslighting isn't just about lying. It's about erasing your truth and replacing it with their version. So you're trapped inside a maze with no clear exit. The air shifts as you enter the chamber of silent treatment, a space colder than ice, where absence speaks louder than words. Here, punishment isn't loud accusations or angry outbursts. It's the crushing void of being ignored, like you've suddenly become invisible in a room full of people. Picture the Victorian era's strict social etiquette, where a slight glance or deliberate silence could signal disgrace, sending a person into social exile without a single word spoken. Historians still argue whether such silent punishments were tools of control or simply reflections of rigid social norms. Modern manipulators wield the silent treatment like a weapon, cutting off communication to make you squirm in uncertainty. Why won't they talk to me? You wonder, your mind racing to find the cause. Your world shrinks to the echo of unanswered messages and cold shoulders. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient Native American tribes practiced silent treatments as a form of conflict resolution, where extended silence allowed tempers to cool. Though obviously, in manipulative hands, this tradition twists into punishment. You recall the moments you asked, "What's wrong?" only to be met with a wall of silence. Hours turned into days. Each unanswered text or ignored call felt like a tiny death, a rejection more painful than any shouting match. Historians still debate whether this tactic evolved from early human societies where ostracism was a survival tool, rejecting members who threatened the group's cohesion, or if it's simply a psychological power play born of insecurity. Psychologists caution that silent treatment breeds anxiety and self-doubt. You start questioning your own worth, wondering if you're broken or unlovable. The silence becomes deafening, a vacuum sucking out your confidence and leaving only fear. Imagine standing in a crowded room where everyone suddenly stops talking to you, turning their backs as if you don't exist. That's the silent treatment, a social void where your presence is denied and your importance erased. You remember that aching loneliness, the desperate hope that one word would break the silence. And when it didn't come, you felt yourself shrinking, losing pieces of who you are with every passing hour. In this cold chamber, you realize silence can speak louder than any insult. And the manipulator knows that leaving you in this quiet torment makes you more likely to bend, to apologize, to chase after their attention once more. The hallway darkens further as you enter the chamber of blame shifting, a maze where responsibility evaporates, and you're left carrying the weight of mistakes that aren't yours. Here, accountability is a foreign word, and the manipulator's favorite game is turning the tables until you're the one apologizing for their faults. Think of the political intrigue of the Byzantine Empire, where emperors deftly shifted blame onto scapegoats to maintain their throne. Historians still argue whether this practice was a necessary survival tactic or pure manipulation. Modern manipulators twist facts like contortionists, making you question your role in conflicts. If you hadn't done X, I wouldn't have reacted like this, they say, slipping the blame onto your shoulders. You find yourself apologizing more, defending less, and doubting your own perceptions. A quirky tidbit: medieval courts often had a fool whose role was to speak uncomfortable truths disguised as jokes, sometimes shifting blame cleverly to highlight faults without incurring wrath. Manipulators lack such humor, but use blame like a dagger. You remember the times you tried to explain your side, only to be met with, "You're always making things worse," or, "If you just listened, none of this would happen." Slowly, your confidence erodes, replaced by a nagging feeling of guilt. Historians still debate whether blame shifting was institutionalized in certain societies as a political tool to divert unrest, or if it's simply a human instinct to avoid responsibility. Psychologists warn that blame shifting can create a toxic feedback loop where you start internalizing false guilt, which the manipulator exploits to maintain dominance. Imagine a court where the accused pleads innocence, but the judge continually accuses them of crimes they never committed. That's the power of blame shifting, turning victim into culprit with a practiced smile. You feel the frustration mounting, but the manipulator's words echo louder. "You're the problem here." The spiral tightens, and you wonder if you'll ever be free of this burden that's not yours to bear. You find yourself walking into a chamber painted with whispers and half-truths, the den of misinformation. This is where the manipulator twists facts and bends reality. So what you believe is a kaleidoscope of distortions designed to keep you off balance and unsure of what's true. Imagine the ancient libraries of Alexandria, filled with scrolls of knowledge, yet even there, rumors and fabricated stories circulated, shaping history in unexpected ways. Historians still argue whether some ancient propaganda was state-sponsored or simply organic folklore. Modern manipulators are masters of spinning narratives. "I never said that," they claim when caught in a lie. "You're remembering it wrong," they insist when you present facts. Slowly, your grasp on reality slips, replaced by their carefully constructed fictions. A quirky tidbit: some Renaissance painters used visual symbolism to convey political messages, embedding hidden meanings that only a few could decipher. Early manipulation of perception through art. You recall moments when facts you once trusted were suddenly questioned by them, leaving you second-guessing your own memory. You start to wonder, is the truth really out there, or is it just whatever they say? Historians still debate whether propaganda techniques truly shaped public opinion in early modern Europe or if the masses were more resistant than we think. Either way, manipulation of truth has always been a powerful tool. Psychologists warn that exposure to repeated misinformation causes cognitive dissonance, a mental tug-of-war that weakens your confidence and critical thinking. The manipulator uses this to keep you dependent on their version of reality. Imagine walking through a fog where every landmark looks different depending on who's guiding you. That's misinformation, a shifting landscape that leaves you lost and vulnerable. You remember the confusion, the frustration, the desperate need to clarify what's real. And when you try, you're met with a dismissive, "You don't understand the whole story." The story, it seems, is always theirs to tell. In this chamber, you realize that truth is the manipulator's most prized possession, and by controlling it, they control everything. You step into the dimly lit chamber of triangulation, where relationships become weapons and people are pawns in a game you didn't agree to play. Here, the manipulator pulls strings behind the scenes, creating conflicts, alliances, and chaos, pitting you against others to keep control firmly in their grasp. Consider the sprawling courts of Louis XIV, where courtiers whispered rumors and jockeyed for the king's favor, using alliances and betrayals as political currency. Historians still debate whether this intrigue was a necessary part of court life or a toxic power struggle. Modern manipulators are masters of triangulation, making you doubt your friends or family by spinning stories meant to isolate you. So-and-so said this about you, or they don't really care, they suggest, sowing seeds of mistrust. You find yourself second-guessing loyalties, walking on eggshells around everyone. A quirky tidbit: In Shakespearean dramas, characters often use triangulation, playing friends against each other to achieve their goals. Some scholars argue this reflects timeless human behavior rather than unique to any era. You remember the pangs of confusion and loneliness, wondering if you're truly the outsider in your own circle. The manipulator's subtle whispers echo, they don't have your best interests at heart. And just like that, you feel cut off, even when surrounded by people. Historians still argue whether such court intrigues shaped broader political outcomes or were simply the side effects of concentrated power. Either way, the personal consequences were very real. Psychologists warn that triangulation can erode your support system, making you increasingly dependent on the manipulator as your only trusted ally. It's a clever trap disguised as concern. Imagine a spider weaving a web of invisible threads, each one connecting people in a way that traps rather than frees. That's triangulation, turning relationships into instruments of control. You recall the aching isolation, the moments when you wished you could trust again, but the manipulator's voice holds you captive. You can't trust anyone but me. And with that, the web tightens. You drift into the murky chamber of love bombing, where affection floods in like a sudden summer storm, warm and overwhelming, only to leave you drenched in confusion once it passes. This is the manipulator's honey trap, a swirl of intense attention, compliments, and promises designed to sweep you off your feet and trap you in their world. Picture the courtships of the Renaissance era, where suitors showered potential brides with lavish gifts and grand gestures, sometimes as genuine love, other times as calculated moves to secure alliances. Historians still debate whether some of these gestures were sincere or veiled manipulations. Modern love bombers flood your senses with admiration and devotion early on, making you feel like the most important person in the universe. You're amazing, no one understands you like I do. They whisper, their words intoxicating. You're swept into a whirlwind, your defenses lowered, your heart racing. A quirky tidbit. Ancient Roman poets described extravagant courtship rituals that sometimes masked political ambition rather than romantic intent, early forms of love bombing in history's love letters. You remember the dizzying rush of compliments, the intense texts, the grand promises whispered late at night. It feels magical until cracks begin to show, and the affection turns conditional or disappears altogether. Historians still argue whether love bombing is a modern psychological term applied retroactively to past courtship behaviors or a timeless manipulation tactic refined over centuries. Psychologists caution that love bombing creates an emotional dependency that makes it hard to leave, especially once the manipulator withdraws affection and replaces it with coldness or criticism. Imagine being caught in a sudden, bright storm, the sun warm and blinding, then the rain turning cold and relentless. That's love bombing, an emotional roller coaster designed to keep you hooked. You recall the conflicting feelings, the thrill of being adored and the slow, creeping doubt when the attention fades. The manipulator's voice haunts you. You won't find anyone who loves you like I do. And in that moment, you question everything. You step into the shadowed chamber of devaluation, the slow, insidious erosion of your worth that creeps in like a quiet fog, dulling your confidence and dimming your light. Here, compliments turn into backhanded insults, praise is laced with sarcasm, and your achievements are downplayed until you barely recognize yourself. Think of the royal courts of medieval Europe, where courtiers might subtly undermine rivals through gossip or dismissive remarks, eroding reputations with a smile. Historians still debate whether such subtlety was a survival tactic or outright cruelty. Modern manipulators master devaluation, making you feel unworthy, incompetent, or ridiculous. You're too sensitive, they say, or you always mess things up. It's a steady drip of negativity that seeps into your self-image, leaving you unsure if you can trust your own abilities or judgment. A quirky tidbit. In ancient Rome, satirical poets often mocked public figures with sharp wit, blending humor with harsh criticism, a cultural form of devaluation that could make or break reputations. You remember the sting of those casual put-downs, the jokes at your expense disguised as humor, the times you laughed along even as your heart sank. The manipulator's voice echoes. No one else would put up with you. Historians still argue whether this kind of social undermining served as a way to maintain group cohesion or simply bred toxic competition and insecurity. Psychologists warn that prolonged devaluation damages self-esteem, making you increasingly dependent on the manipulator for approval, even as they erode it. Imagine standing in a mirror hall where every reflection distorts your image, showing you as smaller, weaker, less worthy. That's devaluation, warping your perception until you forget your true value. You feel the quiet despair creeping in, but the manipulator's words hold power. You're lucky I even tolerate you. And with that, you begin to believe it, bit by bit. Now, you enter the final chamber, future faking, the art of dangling dreams just out of reach. Here, promises glitter like distant stars, guiding you forward with hope, only to vanish into the night, leaving you grasping at illusions. Imagine the explorers of the Age of Discovery, chasing promises of El Dorado and new worlds, some genuine, some mere legends spun to lure adventurers into peril. Historians still debate how much of those tales were hopeful dreams versus calculated deceptions. Manipulators wield future faking with expert precision. We'll get married someday. I'm changing for you. Or this is just temporary. The words promise a better tomorrow but rarely materialize, keeping you tethered to a false horizon. A quirky tidbit. In ancient folklore, the will-o'-the-wisp lured travelers into dangerous swamps with flickering lights, an eerie metaphor for future faking's false hopes. You remember clinging to those promises, the vision of a shared future lighting up dark moments. But as time passed, the promises faded, replaced by excuses, distractions, or silence. Historians still debate whether such hopeful promises in political or social movements were sincere visions or manipulative tools to maintain control over followers. Psychologists caution that future faking hooks you with hope, making it difficult to break free even when evidence shows otherwise. It's the ultimate emotional bait, dreams sold at a steep price. Imagine chasing a mirage on a hot desert road, the image shimmering just ahead but always slipping away as you approach. That's future faking, hope's cruel mirage that keeps you reaching but never arriving. You feel the ache of longing, the exhaustion of waiting for a future that never comes. Yet the manipulator's voice still whispers, just a little longer. Trust me. And with that, the cycle begins anew. Word count, 1,045, wind down, 300 words. Now, as the shadows of manipulation fade, you find yourself standing in a quiet clearing, the air soft and still. The heavy weight of control loosens its grip, replaced by a gentle breeze that whispers of calm and clarity. It's okay to feel tangled in these webs of influence. Human minds are remarkably complex, and even the sharpest can be caught off guard. But as you breathe slowly, in and out, imagine shedding those layers of doubt and confusion like a heavy coat. The world around you softens, colors mellow, and sounds dim to a soothing hum. Remember, the power to reclaim your reality lies within you, your thoughts, your feelings, your truths. Let the memories of gaslighting, blame, and deception drift away, replaced by the quiet strength that grows in understanding and awareness. You're not alone in this journey. Many have walked this path and found the light beyond the maze. So as your eyes grow heavy and your mind unwinds, let these gentle truths settle deep inside. You are worthy, your perceptions matter, and your story is yours to tell. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let yourself drift peacefully into rest.